Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we'll speak about death and dying from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective. Anyone who wants to learn to prepare for death, both spiritually and practically, today is the day that you want to receive the message we're about to get from a very special guest. He blends the ancient wisdom of the East with modern knowledge from the West. In 2009, he released The Power and the Pain, Transforming Spiritual Hardship into Joy, one of the few books describing the shadow side of the spiritual path. Also known as an expert on death and dying, in 2003, he released his next book, Preparing to Die, Practical Advice and Spiritual Wisdom from the Tibetan Buddhist Perspective. He's joining us here on the program today with his latest book, In Meditation in the I-Generation, How to Meditate in a World of Speed and Stress, was published, and his forthcoming book, Dream Yoga, Illuminating Your Life Through Lucid Dreaming and the Tibetan Yogas of Sleep, is set to be published in 2016. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Andrew Holacek. Andrew, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, tell us how you got involved in the study and the practice of death and dying. Was there a particular inspiration behind that?
Yeah, there was. It's interesting. Yeah, such a cheery topic. Why study it? I had been teaching at a small meditation center in the Denver area, and the center director actually asked me if I would consider teaching a course on what's called Tibetan thanatology. Thanatology is a big word, but it basically just means the study of death and dying. And I was always intrigued by the way the Tibetans approach this topic. They have a really marvelous, very thorough literature on it. So I started reading into it and accepted his invitation and started doing some, very kind of informal presentations on the topic. And then one day, really kind of out of the blue, I received a phone call, from a woman in rural Colorado who got my number from the center director. And they were out in the middle of nowhere, and it was really kind of a heart-rending story because her husband of 40 years was in the final stages of his life. And she wasn't overtly a Buddhist, but she was interested in kind of alternative approaches and had an interest in so-called Eastern philosophy. So she reached out to me, and she really had no one else to talk to kind of guide her and counsel her, and really in one of her greatest hours of needs. And over the next couple of days, really as her husband was dying and up until his death, she called and we talked virtually every day. And what was really haunting to me, Daniel, was very often when I was talking to her and trying to, at that point, create some semblance of confidence in my just developing understanding of this vast topic, in the background, she was whispering to herself quite frequently, I wish I would have prepared. I wish I would have prepared. And it really struck me like a thunderbolt, this wonderful woman with a really difficult situation on her hands with no real preparation underneath her belt. So I made a bit of a resolution at that time to do whatever I could to help other people go through that kind of unnecessary hardship, and hence was born my real deep study. And I'd like to add immediately, it's not just a study of death and dying, but the practice of death and dying, and we can talk a little bit more about what that actually means. But the fundamental point I hope to try to convey in the time I have with you is that we do not have to go into this challenging period of our lives unprepared. There's really wonderful, rich teachings, not only in the Buddhist tradition, but obviously in other wisdom traditions, that can really guide us and be a wonderful, almost midwife during this time of profound transformation.
Now, what is it about death, do you think, that, in your experience, people seem to fear?
Oh, I think it's different for different folks. I think largely, you could say it's fear of the unknown. I think that's a large part of it, but there's also very, more practical levels of fear of dependency, fear of becoming a burden. I mean, there's a kind of a standard list of why people are so anxious and just afraid at the end of life. But probably the overarching reason is they just don't know what's going to happen. And I mean, really, when I look at my own experience, fear is virtually synonymous with ignorance, with not knowing. I mean, we're always afraid of what we don't know. So if we can bring some light into dark situations, and there probably isn't anything as dark as death, then you can transform what is arguably the greatest obstacle to life into the greatest opportunity. In many spiritual traditions really proclaim that there are more opportunities for rapid psychological and spiritual development at the end stages of life than at any other point. And quite literally, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity if a person has the wherewithal and the kind of armamentarium to approach these end stages properly.
Now tell us what the practice of death is.
Yeah, it again, if you look at your own experience, we go through many deaths all the time, don't we? I mean, really, any time a relationship ends, one of the reasons it's painful is because it really does feel like a small death. I mean, you lose a job, you lose a pet, you lose anything, excuse me, and there's always kind of a miniature death that takes place then. So in so many ways, a euphemism for death is letting go. I mean, that's really one of the overarching kind of commands of nature and reality at the end of life, is that we're being forced to just let go of false levels of identification. And the way one can practice and rehearse for death, therefore, is to really learn how to let go before we're forced to do so. And there's a wonderful aphorism that actually comes from a Christian mystic. His name is Abraham of Santa Clara. It's quite famous. You think it comes from the Zen tradition because it sounds very Zen-y. But he said something that really is almost like an archetypal summary of the whole kind of preparation towards death. And he basically said, if you die before you die, then when you die, you will not die. And that's really quite an interesting statement. And really what it means, if we unpack it, is that if you can let go, if you can let go before you're forced to let go of all these false levels of identification, identifying with our body, identifying with our thoughts, with our emotions, with all these either articulate or inarticulate senses of who we really are, or who we think we are, I should say. If we can let go of these things before we're forced to do so, then at the end of death, at the end of life, when death comes upon us, you could argue that there's nothing to fear, there's everything to look forward to, because you've done all the releasing, all the dying before you have to do it. And I discovered this firsthand through a number of really long meditation retreats. I did a 3-year meditation retreat, over a decade ago, and it was extraordinarily difficult for me. It really did feel, I can't speak with total assurance that this is what it will feel like when I literally die, but there were certainly many similarities to going into retreat. I lost my job, I lost my house, I ended up losing my relationship, and it really was probably the closest thing I'll experience in this life to death. And but yet there was a real fortitude that was developed around it, a kind of immutable strength that came from associating with the deeper aspect of my identity, kind of the core of my heart mind, which these wisdom traditions assert is really not subject to the vicissitudes of time and space. And this is no small thing. So if we can really differentiate, not dissociate, a small distinction but an important one, if we can differentiate, let go, die to these false levels of identity while we can, and do so on our terms, and arguably you could say that, certainly my experience would echo this, that the entire spiritual path, as I've come to understand it, is really kind of a death in slow motion. Then we can take refuge in this fundamental kind of deathless quality of our being, which so many of these wisdom traditions put forth as who we really are. And this is no small thing, Daniel, because what it means, therefore, is that there is within us, as many of these traditions assert, and then more importantly, actually invite, say, here's what we say, but find out for yourself. At the core of your being, there's this indestructible, deathless quality. And if you can come to associate, identify with that, then really death is an illusion. It doesn't really have any meaning anymore. And this is really critically important, because this is the part of you that doesn't get cancer, it doesn't get AIDS, it doesn't get Alzheimer's. It's actually something that doesn't really even enter the world of space and time. And many traditions put this forth, not just the Buddhist tradition. And the practices, the meditations, are really about learning how to identify with that so that when we're forced to let go of everything else, we've already done it, and therefore it just becomes really just like changing clothes. No big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah, I understand that you teach what's known as reverse meditations. What are those?
Oh, yeah, that's another good one. Yeah. Well, they're called reverse meditations, and they're very helpful in terms of relating to unwanted experiences, because when most people think of meditation, and I'd be curious to see how you think about meditation, but when most people think about meditation, they think of entering a kind of serene, tranquil, quiet state, and there's certainly some validity to that, no question. So they're called reverse meditations because what you do is you put yourself, again, voluntarily, in situations that really are, the reverse of what we normally think of as meditation. So in other words, what a couple of examples would be working with what's referred to just a simple pain meditation. And it might seem a little, morose from the outside, but if you hang with me here, you'll see the power in it. And what is involved with this is that on your own terms, and usually under the guidance of somebody who's going to kind of work you through it, because most people don't really want to do these things. They're generally a bit unpleasant at first. So one reverse meditation would be to simply bring about voluntarily a little bit of pain, like pinching your finger or biting your lip or biting your tongue. And then instead of running away from it and doing, the knee-jerk aversion thing, in other words, inappropriate relationship, you actually learn how to relate to the discomfort properly. And the reason this is so important is that one of the definitions of suffering, I find that's really quite kind of fruitful in my life, is that suffering is pain plus resistance. It's like almost like a mathematical equation, S equals P plus R. So if you can work with the resistance on your terms that we usually bring to unwanted circumstances, and of course what's perhaps the most unwanted circumstance, well, it's death. If you can start to establish a sane relationship to unwanted experiences, pain, death, any unwanted thing you can think of, then you basically drop the resistance and you get rid of the suffering. So then you're just simply left with raw sensation. And this is no small thing in my experience. It allows you to, therefore, let's say another one. Here's a really classic example, Daniel. Let's say you're in the middle of Times Square or India, where I go a lot, or a really chaotic environment that would usually just kind of pull your awareness away and cause you to enter a state of kind of defensive self-contraction or even aversion. If you've actually done some kind of reverse meditation, in this case, it would be voluntarily putting yourself in a really chaotic situation and working to maintain an open, receptive quality of mind around it. So what happens then is that increased receptivity or accommodation allows an unwanted circumstance to dissipate because, as far as I can tell, virtually all our suffering comes from our inability to accommodate our experience. And when we have negative experiences, and again, what's more negative than death, the usual response is a defensive self-contraction and resistance. It's like Dylan Thomas very famously wrote, this beautiful, haunting poem when he said, do not go silently into that good night, rage against the dying of the light. Well, that really represents, you could argue, the Western approach to death, which is rage, deny. And what the wisdom traditions say, well, if you relate to it in a completely different way, open to it, open your heart, open your mind, allow yourself to really relax into what is completely, utterly unavoidable. We all have to face it. Really, the issue then is how are we going to relate to it? And by working with these reverse meditations, we can learn how to relate to unwanted circumstances in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. You bring up something I find really interesting about the human condition, especially as you predicate this toward the Western view of things, is that we tend to think as bad things happen, that shouldn't have happened to us.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And death is certainly one of those things, but look, it's going to happen to all of us. There's not a damn thing anybody can do about it.
That's right.
And that we take a position, why did this happen to me? I didn't ask for this.
Right.
All this denial that you're talking about here, what's that all about, do you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's just spot on. It's fantastic. There are a couple of really haunting quotes, if I can just throw these in, that I find really spot on here. One is from Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, when he said, death is un-American, which is really the view of the West. And another one is Jack LaLanne. You remember him, the great fitness guy?
Sure. 62
yeah,
boats he swam with.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he once said, fantastically, he said, I can't die. It will wreck my image. So, we really live, as you nailed it, and so many people have written about it so potently, we truly live in the denial of death. And I think it's really the ostrich syndrome where, again, we don't simply want to face reality. We're unwilling to look at the shadow side of life. And so much of what I have written about and continue to write about, in the books that you mentioned, are the kind of the darker sides of life, the shadow sides of literal and metaphorical of the human condition. And we don't have to live that way. And again, by raising our gaze, so to speak, and looking, putting our situation in perspective, like you say, like, why me? We have this kind of poverty mentality about these unwanted circumstances. One way to immediately work with that is to realize, for instance, if you are in the process of the end stages of life, realizing that there are about 283,000 people that die every day. And there are, obviously countless trillions of other sentient beings, in other words, our animal friends who die every day. So we're living in an ocean of impermanence and death, and yet we stick our heads in the sand and hide from it because it challenges, it's really an affront to our sensibilities and to our kind of self-centered way of looking at things. So, it just doesn't make sense. It's like you said, Daniel, if we don't relate to these experiences properly, we all have to face them. We can't do a damn thing about them, like you said. That's what really kind of predisposes a person towards a difficult death. That's what, in my experience, being at the side of people who die, the ones who really have a hard time dying are the ones who simply can't get out of the way and let nature run its course. It's amazing. Death is one of the very few things in life you don't have to do. What constitutes a good death is simply allowing this natural process of life to take place without interference. That's what constitutes a good death. But for all of us who are so, kind of trained in the Western world to grasp and to fight and to resist and to deny death, the denial of death in the medical community is absolutely astounding and extraordinarily unfortunate. So what writers like myself and others are trying to do, hospice movement and others, is simply trying to say, let's embrace, relate to what is an unavoidable situation in a skillful way and transform, quite literally, the greatest obstacle into greatest opportunity. And really, in your own experience, think about how your life would change if you had actually something to look forward to at the end of life instead of living in denial of it and running from it. It completely alters the way we relate to the end stages of life. And this is so much what I try to do with people and in my workshops and in my writing. I've had the great good fortune to be around people who have actually gone through this transition with some of the tools that I represent from these wisdom traditions. And I've seen it in application, and I think any hospice worker who has skillful means like this will attest that there are so many ways we can really help ourselves and, just as importantly, others as we go through these transition times. And again, this applies to counseling someone when they lose a relationship, when they lose anything. These basic principles of loss, are all in application. So, somewhat long-winded response to your question about denial, and I hope I hit it somewhere in there.
Certainly did. I noticed that you study with Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche.
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly talked about him from time to time on the program, as I met and interviewed him back in 2000, I believe it was.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
And what was fascinating about him was that as I went out to receive him in the lobby of the station that I was working at the time, there was this tremendous sense of calm around this guy.
Yeah, isn't it?
And
Yeah.
I described to people that it would be like if you were out in a war and there was bomb shelling going on all around you. If you were next to him, you would felt like there was this invisible field that you wouldn't have to worry about anything.
Yes, exactly. It's lovely.
And it's
lovely.
really fascinating to say that because of the kind of energy that a person like him exudes, and
That's
you
right.
realize, well, this is somebody who teaches about meditation, someone who you almost get this feeling that with each step he's walking into a new life, perhaps toward that horizon of death. There ain't really a whole lot to worry about. And I would have to say, what would be the Tibetan Buddhist perspective about death, especially when it comes to things like euthanasia or suicide?
Yeah. Yeah, now you're getting into some gritty topics. Yeah, well, let me just say one thing briefly about the sense of presence, and then we'll get to some of these more challenging topics. I have certainly experienced the same thing you have, Daniel, and it's really a magical experience. It's obviously not just the exclusive domain of Tibetans, of course not. I've experienced it with great spiritual beings, meditative beings, and I've thought about it a lot, and it's like, well, what's kind of going on here? And in fact, interesting, parenthetically, that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his Tibetan name is Kundan, which translates as presence. I think that's very compelling because when you're around someone like that, just like you were saying with Sakham Rinpoche, there's just this, indescribable, ineffable quality of absolute presence. And I think the way it works is when one engages in a lifetime of contemplative study and most importantly contemplative practice, i.e. meditation, the teachings, they become you. I mean, you quite literally come to embody these wisdom teachings, not just metaphorically, but quite literally. So when you're around an authentic spiritual master from any tradition, you can really feel it. You can feel that sense of embodied awareness and presence and the quality of that mind that has been tamed and trained to just simply be on the dot. And there's something really quite beautiful about it, as you were referring to. I mean, I find it highly magnetizing. It's like, I want to be around this space, and then even more compellingly, it's like, I want to be like that. And that really, for me, has been a large ingredient of detecting authentic teachers and really, taking refuge in that quality of mind. So I just wanted to say something briefly about that. And, the difficult issues, suicide, euthanasia, death of a pet, abortion, all that kind of stuff, very, very challenging. And I think the first thing I want to say is a little bit of a caveat that, when you're dealing with some of the most complex and challenging issues in all of, humanity, one has to be careful that the answers aren't too facile, that they aren't too simple, because it really dismisses the complexity of these issues. But from a Tibetan perspective, in terms of suicide, for instance, there's a very sophisticated way, and again, because these issues themselves are complex and somewhat sophisticated in that regard, they require a kind of a concomitant answer. So one way that the Tibetans approach that is to really talk about what it is that's actually being suicided. In other words, when someone is involved with an act of such desperation, you could argue that really what they're trying to do is not so much kill themselves, but kill the pain. And they conflate the pain with their sense of self. And the reason that's important, and again, this gets into a little bit of Buddhist cosmology, but you asked how the Buddhists would approach it. In Buddhist philosophical thought, what constitutes our experience is the laws of cause and effect, which of course all Eastern traditions or most Eastern traditions refer to as the laws of karma. And it's very easy for people to say, kind of get tripped up on colloquial definitions of karma, but karma is extraordinarily complex, as in fact is all causality, even from a scientific point of view. And the reason I say this, and then rein me in if I'm starting to get too esoteric here, Daniel, but the reason this is important here is that when a person engages in a complex and extraordinarily painful act like suicide from a Buddhist perspective, there are several different ingredients that are involved in what's called a fully constituted act or a fully constituted karma. And really these are the object, the intention, the act, and then a sense of rejoicing or satisfaction in the act. And the reason these four are really somewhat important to understand, especially for someone who is a survivor of suicide, is that the principal ingredient of the consequences of this kind of seemingly negative action are brought about by one's intention. And for the vast majority of people who do commit suicide, unless of course they're doing it to hurt another person, that's a different story. But as I said at the outset, most people engage in these extraordinarily painful acts really out of real confusion. And by understanding that they're really not trying to kill themselves, they're trying to kill their pain, it can bring about both a philosophical and practical kind of reevaluation of what has taken place and how a person, can actually be assisted in that regard. And maybe I'll leave it at that. And maybe you can guide me in terms of where you want to go with it, because, these topics can get pretty complex and pretty philosophical, and I don't want to stray into that territory unless that's where you want to go. So maybe you can guide me in terms of where you want to take this.
Well, we just kind of go along as Buddhists do, don't we? Let's find out, for instance, that I understand that sometimes that in Buddhism with the, best meditators, that they actually look forward to the moment of death. How is that possible?
Yeah, how about that one? Isn't that a story? It's an extraordinary proclamation, and it's replete in the Buddhist literature. They say the highest practitioner looks forward to the moment of death. The middling practitioner has absolutely no fear of death, and the so-called lesser practitioner has absolutely no regrets. Wow, that's some pretty powerful stuff. And I think the reason, if we're shooting for the top, so to speak, the very highest practitioner, when they look forward to death, again, they're not looking forward to it in any kind of perverse, suicidal way.
No.
But they're simply looking forward to it in the sense that they realize they actually have something forward to look to. Really, parenthetically, one of the biggest reasons that we suffer at the moment of death, in addition to our inability to let go, is one of the images I use, is most people when they're dying, the ones that have challenging deaths, are really entering the end stages of life through the rear view mirror. In other words, they're viewing everything from the past. And that isn't to say we shouldn't honor and respect the glories of our relationships in our past lives and celebrate our accomplishments. For sure. But if your mind is so sticky, I like to think of it as the Velcro mind, the grasping, clinging mind, your level of anxiety and pain at the end of life, as it is really with any unwanted circumstance, will be directly proportional to how sticky your mind is. If you have a really sticky mind that grasps onto everything, you're going to have a hard time. Why? As we talked about earlier, because at the end of life, reality, nobody's dictating this, it's just nature running its course, demands that you let go. So the greatest practitioners look forward to it because they've done all the letting go, they've died before they died, and they realize that this great moment of liberation is about to unfold for them. Really from the Buddhist point of view and other kind of esoteric traditions, so to speak, many of them say that at the moment of death you return to Western phraseology would be you return to the embrace of the divine, or you return to God. In Buddhist, we would say you return to your Buddha nature. You're actually coming home to who you truly are. It's the archetypal homecoming. You're returning to the very essence of who you are. And if you really believe that, and if you really not only believe it, but you've experienced it in your deep meditations, where you can enter states of meditation, Daniel, that are really specifically designed to reproduce and mimic the qualities of death. And some of this is really quite astounding, but you can enter, and there have been studies that have shown this, enter states of such profound meditation where respiration ceases entirely. A person is sitting there, they're completely alive, but they're not breathing. What's that about? And this isn't just, new age fluff. This is something that actually has been studied. So these are the people that really, when they then approach the natural end of life, they have absolutely no fear whatsoever, because why? Fear is synonymous with ignorance. There's nothing to be afraid of, because they have a deep, deep experiential understanding of what they're about to experience. In a certain sense, they know exactly where they're going, and hence they look forward to it in the sense of, this is a great opportunity for me to actualize this deeper essence of my being.
I know it seems that as people approach death, especially as individuals, that they tend to reflect and realize the things they regret, mostly that they didn't do, as though there was some predictable way that had that been all accomplished, or at least attempted, that somehow they wouldn't feel as guilty about the fact they're about to die. And I almost find that's kind of almost nonsensical thinking.
Yeah, but it's interesting if you look at this one. If we live our lives, and I have to say, let me share an experience with you that was a real shapeshifter for me. Something that was a very profound point of instruction in my own life is when my own mother died. I was extremely close to my mom. I mean, she was like the perfect mother. I loved her beyond words. And when my father called me, I live in Colorado. My parents were in Michigan. And my mom had been suffering from end-stage Alzheimer's, which is a very difficult disease. And when my father called me, telling me, that your mother has stopped eating, and this is a sidebar thing that maybe we'll have time to get to or not. In the Tibetan view, there's a very articulate description of the phases of dying, and by understanding these phases as they're presented in the literature, in my experience, and I've seen this with hospice workers as well, who are familiar with Buddhist descriptions of death, it's extraordinary how often the stages defined by a spiritual tradition can help you understand literally where a person is on the death trajectory. So my father called, said my mom's dying. My mom stopped eating. I knew that I probably had about a week left, so I immediately jumped on a plane and came back. And I knew I was going to be with her for the very last time. And it was a weekend situation, I remember, and it was, if you've ever been around a dying person, then maybe you've had this experience, but I can assure you, when I was with her, and you see how this all ties into what you were saying just a few minutes ago, I wasn't thinking at all about tomorrow. I wasn't thinking about yesterday. The experience was so poignant. It was such a precious, intensified experience that it absolutely just bolted me into the present moment. And I look back at the time, it was extraordinarily profound. And I look back at it later and I realized what an amazing gift my mother had given to me. I mean, she brought me into this world, and she was like bringing me into spiritual life one last time before she left, because I was bolted into the present moment. I completely found myself utterly present with her, thinking about the extraordinary preciousness that this expression of impermanence was bringing about, and that's what I wanted to get to. And the teaching here for me is that this is one of the great surprises in studying this literature and practicing it extensively for virtually 20 years now, is that it may seem from the outside like, oh, geez, I don't want to deal with this stuff. I mean, who wants to talk about death and dying? Who wants to let alone practice this? But I promise you, if you reframe your life within the embrace of impermanence, and just talk to anybody who's come back from a near-death experience, or anybody who's in the process of terminal diagnosis, it's a very common statement for individuals who are so thrust into the embrace of impermanence to realize that it actually hurls you into life. The study of death and dying, the contemplation of permanence, actually brings you more fully into life, because it erases this kind of death-denying thing we were talking about earlier. If you embrace it and you realize, you know what, I really could die today. I am one breath away from death. I only have to exhale. I don't inhale, and that's it. And if you, not in a morose way, but if you live your life framed with impermanence and death, I promise you it will bring you more fully into life, and you will live it with more vigor and rigor. turn into this kind of fearless gusto. So I think it's, I bring that up because it shows how practical this stuff can be. I mean, obviously I'm interjecting some kind of philosophical, esoteric stuff from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view. But basically, the best definition of Buddhism that I've come across is that Buddhism is simply a description of reality. And one of the things that characterizes reality undeniably is impermanence and death. And if you can come to embrace this kind of shadow side of reality instead of living in denial of it, it paradoxically thrusts you more fearlessly and fully into life. And I invite anybody who has an interest in this arena to really contemplate this deeply and realize there's so many practical blessings behind contemplating this material.
It's just such a fascinating subject. We've certainly talked about it many times here on the program, and I always say, we need to talk about death more often. It needs to be part of the thread of the conversation because there really is no way to avoid it.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
Now, how can people find out more about your work? Is there a website they can go to?
Oh, you're very kind. Yeah, it's andrewholacek.com. It's a fairly active website these days. I'm in the process of, as you so kindly said in the introduction, I'm about to release quite a large volume on the science of lucid dreaming and how to relate. It's another kind of iteration of this theme of exploring darkness. In this case, it's the darkness of the night, but that's obviously a different story. So my website, andrewholacek.com, is a great way. I'm obviously doing this program in your neck of the woods this coming weekend, and I'm at a kind of a wonderful point in my life now where I'm having the luxury of being invited to teach these programs that really inspire me, that I have a lot of passion for around the country and actually even now around the world. So that's probably the best way to find out about my little show and all the adventures that I seem to be up to these days.
And that's andrewholacek.com?
Yeah, HOLECEK, andrewholacek.com. Yeah, it lists all the upcoming programs, and we're loading a lot of stuff on this site in terms of podcasts and even some courses. As you know, the internet has marvelous capabilities of reaching people around the world these days. So I'm a kind of a transformational Luddite. I'm trying to get into the 21st century here, and I'm slowly making my way into it.
Well, very good. Well, Andrew, we want to thank you for making your way onto the radio program today and sharing this wonderful way that people really should be embracing more of, as you said. It brings them into the moment of being fully alive.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Daniel, for having me. And once again, really, I suppose I would like to leave the reader or the listener in this regard with the take-home message that there's so much that we can do to transform our attitudes and relationships to difficult situations, any unwanted circumstance, any disease, any loss. And the wisdom traditions, of course, of which Buddhism is just one, they have so many skillful means that can really allow people to take these otherwise excruciatingly difficult situations and bring them onto their path of psychological and spiritual growth. And by doing that, instill a peace of mind in themselves, as you were suggesting that you feel with someone like the Sakdang, Dipama Pache, and then be a profound benefit for themselves to others, and that's no small thing. So thank you so much for inviting me, Daniel. I so appreciate it.
You bet. It's been a true pleasure, definitely. We want to thank you, the listener out there, for tuning in. You can find out more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Please sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio and like us on Facebook as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.